Welcome back to everyone for this 50th celebration of environmental studies at Williams. I think it's really wonderful to see so many of you here, people whom I knew until I left in 1990, and I look forward over the next couple of days of meeting some of you who were here after I left. I think, let's see, I think I saw Bill Fox here, Roger Bolton, me. There were only a few of us who were at the beginning, who are still around and still working on environmental things. So I've been asked to provide a little overview of the trajectory that the center has taken, and I'd just like to take you on that journey because I think it's really interesting because a calendar moves uniformly and smoothly, right? It's the same number, 365 and a quarter days a year and so on and so forth. But the progress of the development of something like the Center for Environmental Studies and the Environmental Studies program moves more in fits and starts and accelerations and so on. And that makes for an interesting story. I remember I was a very young faculty member here. I'd only been here 2 years, and President Jack Sawyer announced at a faculty meeting sometime in the spring of 1967 that there was going to be an environmental study center. Now, presidents do that kind of thing anymore. And he announced that there were going to be some people. Andrew Sheffey was coming from UMass, and Charles Schweighauser, class of 58, who was running a planetarium in St. Louis. I don't know what that had to do with the environment. Anyway, he was going to be there. And someone named Sheaf Satterthwaite. Took all of us a while to be able to pronounce Sheaf's full name and get the right emphasis where it should be. It didn't take Sheaf much time to place the emphasis in the right place, but that's a different story. So there was no mention of the role of students or of faculty. It was going to be a research and outreach center. And the purpose was to address something called the metropolitan hinterland, which none of us had any clue as to what that might mean. So despite the fact that Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, had come out just 5 years before and had put the finger on pesticides as killing off birds and insects and causing all kinds of problems, cancer in people and so forth, that wasn't on the agenda. There had been a killer smog in Donora, Pennsylvania a few years back, and smog was a huge problem in California, but that wasn't on the agenda. Lake Erie was dying. All the fish were disappearing. Algae was proliferating. And rivers were so polluted that the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland had burned multiple times, and that wasn't on the agenda. So the question was, what was this going to be about? And we were going to find out in the fall at fall convocation. And James McGregor Burns, our Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer in political scientist, had enough pull in the Democratic Party to get Mrs. Johnson, Lady Bird Johnson, here for the convocation. Now, Mrs. Johnson had some important environmental criteria. She had beautified the highways of Texas by planting native flowers and not letting them spray them with herbicide. So that was actually something. She was greeted, as she began her presentation, by 30 or 40 students who stood up, turned their back on her because of her husband's Vietnam War actions. The 60s were complex. They were complicated. There was a lot going on. And then I think it was either later that year or during that year, or maybe it was in the fall of the next year. I can't quite remember. I wasn't able to find it in the records. The Williams Record published an article about the work of the Center for Development Economics, which had been founded, I think, in 1960. And this was a center that brought people from developing countries to teach them how to develop economically. These were former colonies for the most part, and except for Ethiopia, they were brought here to learn how to do better. And there was a phrase in there that some of us on the faculty interpreted as the only way to bring people out of poverty is to give them money, and that will solve the problem. And the science faculty went nuts. I mean, there was all this stuff about, there was, Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb was published in '68. As I said, Rachel Carson's book. Barry Commoner was talking about the connection between technology and the environmental degradation, and that would be talked about more in his book, Closing Circle, in a few years. So the scientist responded with a rejoinder, also in the Williams record. And fortunately, these were adults, and they said, we should get together and talk about this. And so we did. Well, it was an amazing battle of the disciplines. The economists believed they knew how the world worked, and the scientists believed they knew how the world worked. And it was not the same explanatory myth. It was a different myth in each discipline. And when the smoke cleared, it was decided that while we could not all agree, we owed it to our students to expose them to these different perspectives. And so we began setting up courses. Actually, I think Chief Satterthwaite's course on land use planning, rural land use planning, was maybe one of the first ones. And there were several others. And there was an attempt to set up a more formal structure. Actually, at one point, a proposal to make it a major and so forth, the coordinate major, and that was shot down by the Committee on Educational Policy, never even got the faculty for a vote. And so we ended up with a program, a coordinate program, 6 courses instead of 8 or 9, and so on and so forth. Many of you went through that and did very well by it. Now, Roger Bolton played a very critical role, interesting, one of the part of the other team from the sciences point of view, nevertheless, was chair of the faculty committee, and he was, one thing I got to say about Roger, he is really fair. He is really fair. He really managed that very well, but then unfortunately he took a leave of absence the year we were trying to negotiate getting a major. We stumbled on, and we worked through various kinds of options. By the way, this insistence on disciplinary focus really dogged the program for most of its life. In other words, it really had to be disciplinarians teaching their perspective, and students then had to figure it out on their own. And that's okay as far as it goes, but other places like Duke and Yale created whole schools of environmental studies, undergraduate and graduate, and it took until fairly recently before Williams had a full separate standalone major. Well, in December of 1969, my department chair, Charlie Compton, in chemistry, I'm a chemist, I came here as a chemist, came to me and said, you know, Bill, there are only 2 people who've signed up for your advanced thermodynamics course next year. Charlie, how could a charismatic course like advanced thermodynamics attract only 2 students? It wasn't even at 8 o'clock in the morning. I mean, it was, I did everything I could. And he said, how would you feel about teaching that environmental chemistry course you told me you thought you might do someday? And being young and foolish, I said, sure, Charlie, I'll do that. That was in December. I was going to start teaching it on February 1st. Fortunately, there was the early stages of winter study, so I had that time to do it, to prepare for it. Well, I had 2 boxes full of these sort of bank box things. This is, for those of the younger people here, this is way pre-digital. Everything was paper. And I had 2 boxes which I had accumulated while I was doing my PhD studies at MIT, where I was working on organic semiconductors, and my procrastination was to go down and find these articles on the environment that I found actually much more interesting. And that turned out to be the basis for the course. So I faced a common problem with my other colleagues. There was no precedent for anything we were doing, right? There were no texts, no books. A few journals that were publishing articles, but they weren't in the traditional disciplines. And so we had to make it up. True confession, we made it up as we went along. And we started from scratch, and off we went. So mine would be a course for non-science majors. They get Division III credit for that. And under pressure, I later opened it up to science majors because there's nothing like this for us. And we feel being cheated if we don't get to do this. The non-science majors were terrified that they were going to be outgraded by the science students. It was a moot point. The science students didn't do any better than the non-science students in applying logic to environmental problems. I mean, the whole thing was so new that it just didn't follow the traditional ways of thinking about things. So the new course was announced 1 week before the start of spring semester. And on February 1st, I walked into class over on the science quad. There were 75 eager students sitting there. Oh boy. And I took a deep breath and we started. And a few weeks later, well, actually more than a few weeks later, it was about April, I arrived at class and there was a dean waiting. Many of the students in this class had, at 3 a.m. in the morning, run out of West College to confront a truck spraying pesticides into the elm trees with the pesticide floating into their bedrooms, and they had stopped the whole operation. And the dean's office wanted to know what was Moomaw teaching these students over there across the campus. Well, one of the things I learned from Jack Sawyer is whenever there was a crisis, Jack always used to refer to it as a teachable moment, which I thought was just brilliant, right? And so I said to myself, well, I'm going to have a teachable moment here. So we abandoned the syllabus topic of the day, solid waste, for pesticides and their structure chemically, and which kind would concentrate and which wouldn't, and so on and so forth. And my ad hoc response must have worked because I didn't get fired and I got to finish the course, well, sort of. So little did I know that April 22nd of that year would be the first Earth Day, right? For those of you who are still early in your careers, as Woody Allen says, 80% of success is showing up. And I would argue another 15% is timing. And my timing and showing up were just perfect that year. I couldn't have done better. It turns out that Earth Day is still among the largest civic engagements in terms of numbers of people who have participated in the history of the United States. And it's clear that we were all breathing the same zeitgeist, right? I mean, it was just around us. So I was desperately, a little about this time, trying to figure out what am I going to do for a final exam? I mean, I'm literally barely keeping ahead of the students. I mean, I had everything laid out, but it's still, okay, and now what do I do? And Richard Nixon bombed Cambodia. The students revolted, shut down the college as their peers did across the country, and I never had to give the exam that year. Instead, I was recruited to teach-ins on things like Agent Orange and napalm and other things like that. And so this breathing spell gave me the time to actually figure out what I was going to do the following year, and I had a pretty decent exam by that time. Now, there are actually two of our current trustees who took that course. One of them is Martha Williams, class of 77, and the other one is Mark Terceira, class of 79, who is now the CEO, the CEO of the Nature Conservancy. And it's very funny, whenever at any event where Mark is, he always, if he spots me in the audience, he always tells how I got him started in this. He took a 25-year detour at Goldman Sachs, but he came around in the end. That's the point. Now, the curriculum grew richer over time. Courses in the humanities, some wonderful things. John Huston's comparison of religious attitudes towards nature, Nathaniel Lawrence's philosophy of nature course, Don Gifford's English literature class on the American Renaissance, environmental economics appeared, and the geologist converted geology from rocks and rocks for jocks and those kind of courses to a real modern earth science program. And our attempt at interdisciplinary teaching required us to each be disciplinarians in the same room at the same time. And I did 2 of those. They were both terrific. One was with Roger Bolton and Don Gifford, so economics, English, and chemistry, and of course called environmental perspectives. And there were always 2 of us looking on in amazement while the third one did whatever he did. And then I also did one with Hank Art and Jay Shelton in physics, Hank Art in biology, Jay Shelton in physics, a course on renewable energy, which we did very early on. I mean, there was so little material, we really had to struggle because, you know, photocells were something, PVs, photovoltaic panels were something that NASA did at NASA prices, so it didn't look like it was going to be all that likely we'd get there. And directors. The directors came from backgrounds that were totally new to a liberal arts college. Carl Rydell had a PhD in forest policy and had been a forester, you know, cutting down trees for the U.S. Forest Service. You know, now wait a minute, what discipline is that? Tom Jorling is a lawyer who was just coming fresh from Washington, D.C., where he and a colleague were the principal writers of the Clean Air Act of 1970, which is one of the great pieces of legislation in history. Thank you, Tom, if you're here tonight. So what is environmental studies today? Well, emphasis shifted from land use to local and regional problems and chemical toxicity, but by the 1990s, it had gone global. The stratospheric ozone depletion was the first example we knew of where we had actually interfered so severely with the operating system of the planet that we had changed how it functioned. We had punched a hole in the ozone layer, we had thinned it, and it's a remarkable story told by Richard Benedict, the US negotiator on the Montreal Protocol, was for the first time in history, a multi-billion-dollar global industry was shut down because an invisible gas, chlorofluorocarbons, had thinned a hole in an invisible layer, ozone, to allow invisible radiation, ultraviolet, to penetrate to the earth, and we were going to stop that. It depended on science, it depended on economics, and it depended on policy. Boy, sounds like a great topic for an environmental studies program. And then, of course, there's climate change, which is the big issue today, and it's moving extremely rapidly. So the whole notion of limits to growth, which came out in 1971, I believe, was replaced with a different paradigm, which was the sustainability paradigm. Are we really doing what we need to do to be sustainable for the future? So Our Common Future was published in 1987, so just 30 years ago this year. The chair of that was Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the Prime Minister of Norway. She was a physician, actually trained at Harvard, and about 20 really smart, interesting people from all over the world put this together. And it was in preparation for the Rio Earth Summit, which would take place in 1992. And all governments of the world have endorsed this concept that was there, which is sustainable development, which is defined as meeting, and this is a quote, the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So this is not exactly a deep green agenda. It's not we love nature because it's nature, but it's because of it falls on us if we don't do this right. It falls on our subsequent generations. But it also points out how dependent we are on the operations of the earth, and that there's not a conflict between environment and economics. They must go hand in hand. Poor people suffer the most and and are the least responsible. So it evolved from, environmental studies evolved from, I suppose, what was considered a tree-hugging fad. That was sort of the attitude that I think a lot of senior disciplinary faculty had at the time, which created this thing. because it provides us with a fuller understanding of the Earth and its operations and our deep reliance on the multiple ecosystem services that nature provides. We see the need not only to sustain the environment, but also our societal institutions, and to have an equitable economy for conducting our exchanges. We need to sustainably manage our natural and social capital, as well as our financial capital, to succeed. Environmental studies has managed to integrate the warring academic disciplines of old into a new alliance for understanding the complex problems we face. These insights force us to expand beyond reductionist paradigms to systemic thinking. As a colleague of mine, John Sturman at MIT, who is at the Sloan School of Management, the business school at MIT, he's a professor of systems dynamics. How's that for a title at a business school? As he says, there are no unintended consequences of our actions. There are only consequences for better or for worse. So environmental studies turns the perspective for learning inside out. Instead of examining the world out there from within ourselves, we learn about ourselves by examining the world around us. There we see reflected the consequences of our actions. These consequences tell us about who we are individually and as a society. The systemic insights that come from contemplating the natural and social world and how they interact force us to foresee the future consequences of our action. The curse of foresight is that we now have an ethical responsibility to do something about it. If we know that what we're doing is going to harm someone, either now, somewhere else in the world, or someone else in the future, we have to make a decision. Are we going to do this or not? The encyclical of Pope Francis reminds us that changing the climate and other aspects of the natural world are not just the province of scientists, economists, and diplomats, but are existential issues that many of the poorest people on the planet endure. The poor who contribute the least to climate change are suffering the greatest loss from the multiple consequences of a new and more dangerous climate that we have created by our actions. Pope Francis reminds us that our treatment of the planet, its living creatures, and other people is primarily both a secular and a theological concern for equity and justice. It's amazing how his intervention with that encyclical transformed the negotiations for the Paris Accord. Even hard-nosed diplomats were moved by it and realized this is the problem. So I know that many of you have come through the Williams Environmental Studies program or major, or even have only taken a course or two, play major roles in protecting this planet by ensuring that your actions individually and as a responsible member of society meet the criteria for sustainable development. We will hear from some of our fellow CES alums during this weekend. I think you heard from Ned Sullivan today, you'll hear from Reed Zars and other people tomorrow, and I'm sure that each of you has a story to tell. In this discouraging time where facts are ignored and short-term gain takes precedent over long-term sustainability for all, each and every one of you in this room are making a difference and can continue to make a difference. Let me just close with something very familiar to all of you with a little twist. Henry David Thoreau said, you all know this probably by heart, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not when I came to die discover that I had not lived." By living deliberately in the 21st century, you too can confront the essential facts of today's life, help to shift the world onto a sustainable path, and discover that not only have you lived, but also that you have lived life fully and successfully. Thank you.